Next on C-SPAN, live coverage of a presidential forum on agriculture and rural life, featuring the Democratic presidential candidates. Sponsored by the Prairie Fire Forum, the debate is coming from the C.Y. Stevens Auditorium in Ames, Iowa. 6 of the Democratic candidates are expected to participate.
I'm Ann Canton, the Assistant Commissioner of Agriculture from the state of Minnesota, whose roots are from an Iowa farm. On behalf of the Iowa Farm Unity Coalition, the League of Rural Voters, and Prairie Fire Rural Action, I want to welcome you, along with our national television audience, to the 1988 Presidential Forum on Agriculture and Rural Life. Despite the snow, we are pleased to have people from throughout the heartland with us in Ames, Iowa this afternoon. We extend special greetings to our friends throughout rural America participating in this forum at hundreds of House meetings by way of public television and C-SPAN. The next President of the United States must understand the central importance of agriculture in the American and world economy. Farmers and ranchers are the very base of the largest economic and industrial complex in our nation. The health and vitality of our entire economy is rooted in a sound and profitable family farm agriculture and widespread distribution of land. The farm crisis of the 80s has severely damaged American food producers and eroded our national economy. Thousands of farm families have been driven off their land. Unemployment in farm-related industries has soared. Small-town businesses have collapsed, and rural banks have been closed at record rates, and billions of dollars have been lost in our economy. As we enter the 1988 year, the conventional wisdom of press and many politicians is that the farm crisis is over. Nothing could be further from the truth. The crisis had in fact turned into long-term economic stagnation. It has always been difficult to get the plight and concerns of rural people on the national agenda. We still suffer disproportionately high levels of poverty, substandard housing, poor and declining medical services, and unequal access to technical and financial assistance through government programs. But that is beginning to change. Our people are organizing all across rural America. We've changed a lot of public policies and replaced a lot of politicians in recent years. We're getting stronger. And we in this productive heartland are going to help elect a president this November who will bring economic and social justice to the people of the American countryside. To address these agricultural issues today, we are pleased to have with us 6 presidential candidates from the Democratic Party. Senator Gary Hart, the Reverend Jesse Jackson, Senator Paul Simon, Congressman Richard Gephardt, Governor Mike Dukakis, and Governor Bruce Babbitt. Senator Albert Gore had agreed to participate, but notified us on Monday that he would not be joining us today. Republican candidates were also invited to join us for a similar forum today, but chose not to do so. We are also very pleased to have a questioning panel today. They are Helen Waller of the National Save the Family Farm Coalition, Ben Burkett of the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, Alan Wieshar of the Iowa Farm Unity Coalition, Marcia Cady of station KMTV Omaha, and Ed Seide of the Adair County Free Press. For the next For the next 2 hours, the moments are precious. That's why I'm trying to hold your applause. And the questions are important. Following 2-minute opening statements by each candidate, the order of which has been determined by a draw, the panel will begin its questions. So, for the opening statements, we will begin with you, Senator Hart.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. It's a great pleasure for me to be back in Iowa at this forum 4 years later after participating in a debate that I think helped change the direction of American foreign policy, at least begin the debate in that direction. And today, America stands at a crossroads. We can either take a road forward or a road backward, and Iowa's farmers will be the first to choose which road we take. To go forward, we're going to have to restore democracy to foreign policy by letting producers and not the government decide how to reduce excess stocks and increase prices to farmers. We're going to have to instigate targeted systems whereby moderate and family farmers are those who benefit from those farm programs which we do adopt. We're going to have to restructure farm loans and restore fair credit terms to farmers and borrowers. We're going to have to put rural America on a level playing field in terms of education and schools, housing, and health for our people and transportation systems. We're also going to have to go back to a system of national attention to soil and water conservation. But I think most of all, we're going to have to become major agricultural exporters and world traders in commerce and in agricultural products. And here's where the road divides. I want to lead this country forward. I want to help restore a new fair trading system and fully participate in it. The road backward is a road called protectionism. Whatever you do, don't take that road. Resist it. Say no to it. For your sake, for your children's sake, and for our country's sake. There's no hope and no future down that road for you or for anybody in this country, because the first casualties in an international trade war are going to be America's farmers. As President, I intend to enforce existing trade sanctions under agreements and the law against unfair practices. But we don't need arbitrary unilateral percentage protectionism. It's dangerous, Senator, and it won't solve our problems.
Thank you, Senator Hart. Governor Dukakis.
When I first came out here to Iowa, a lot of people said to me that a governor from the East couldn't understand the problems of the heartland and the problems of agriculture in the heartland. Thanks to the Iowa caucus process, I've listened, I've asked a lot of questions, I've spent time with farm families, in farm communities, I've learned a lot. And if there's one thing that I'm convinced of today, even more than I was when I came out here, it is that we're all in this together. North and south, east and west, urban and rural, we all sink or swim together. There's a second thing that I'm convinced of, even more than I was when I came out here, and that is that the family farm is one of the most important institutions in this country, and any agricultural policy by a President Dukakis will be designed to strengthen the family farm, to strengthen farm communities, to strengthen rural America. Now, what does this mean? First, good, solid credit policies. The new Credit Act, I think, goes a long way toward doing that. Secondly, a combination of supply management and reasonable price supports that stabilize prices, that give our farmers a fair price, and that does so without massive government subsidies that are now running at in excess of $20 billion a year. Third, a strong, focused program of rural development, something I know a great deal about because in my own state we've gone into rural counties and we've had great success at strengthening the economic base, creating off-farm jobs, strengthening the agricultural economy, and doing so in a very dramatic way. And finally, and in some ways, one of the most exciting prospects for us and for a new president, developing new commercial uses for agricultural products. Ethanol, biodegradable plastics, road de-icers that can be made from corn are just a few of the things that we can do not only to take advantage of the productivity of our farmers, but to clean up very serious environmental problems that we have all over this country. What better way to match the productivity of our farmers and our need for improved environmental quality in this country than to use the products of our farmers to create new uses which can expand markets, expand opportunities,
Thank you,
and expand
Governor
the future of our farmers
Dukakis.
all over the United States.
Senator Babbitt.
I think you just promoted me from governor to senator, or is it a demotion? I have two friends in Iowa who have helped me understand the depth and complexity of this crisis. One is a farmer named Russ Anderegg. He's worked all his life on a farm to keep it in the family and to make an honest living. He now finds that he can only do that by sending his son out 3 nights a week to drive a mail truck and to have his daughter-in-law working as a receptionist. And I think something's terribly wrong when people working on the land, families, can't make a living. The second person is Dale Cochran. He's your Secretary of Agriculture. He's my friend. He's endorsed my candidacy. He's showed me how it is that Republican, Reagan farm policies have contributed to this crisis. He's helped me see that the farm program goes to support the wrong people, that 1/2, can you believe this? 1/2 of all of the subsidies in this country go to the top 10% of corporate farmers. It's a policy which sends $10 million support checks to one family, some farm, some family. And I think it's wrong, because I think that family farm policy must begin with targeting the benefits and the supports and the policies to get the agribusinesses out, to say that our obligation lies to that family farm. And we can focus democratic policies which will provide a real living income for Russ Anderegg and his family. Now, there are 6 Democrats here, and we all share that goal of real prices and solid income for family farmers. Whatever details we may disagree on, we agree on that. And that's why a Democrat will be elected president in 1988.
Thank you. Thank you, Governor Babbitt. Congressman Gephardt.
Thank you. The farmers that I talk to here in Iowa are skeptical about this election. And you know, I don't blame them. Candidates come and say the right words and give the right rhetoric about prices and income. And then February the 8th comes and everybody leaves, and the family farmer is left here with the same problems: excess commodities, low prices, and high debt. And it's happened time and time again. So the critical test is not what we say, it's where we stand and what we're willing to fight for. That's why Tom Harkin and I wrote the Harkin-Gephardt Save the Family Farm bill. And we wrote it after 2 years of talking to family farmers and farm organizations. And if we can't pass it this year, and I'm president, I'm going to make it a priority, and we're going to pass the Harkin-Gephardt Save the Family Farm bill. And to those who oppose the bill, I ask, what is your alternative, and how does it work, and how much will it cost? Because in reality, it's your livelihoods that are at stake. And in the end, it's your decision, not the lobbyists, not the establishment, not the politicians. You can, on February the 8th, stand up for change, to save a way of life, to save a culture, to save the family farm.
Thank you, Congressman Gephardt. Senator Simon.
A farmer called my Springfield office and said, I just had to talk to someone. I just left my neighbor in his driveway. They just sold his farm machinery. He's been my neighbor for 29 years. He was crying. I've never seen my neighbor cry before. That's more than a statistic. It is a tragedy, and a needless tragedy, in this country. We can do much better for farmers and for our rural economy. My home is Route 1, McKanda, Illinois, population 402. My grandparents were dairy farmers. Many of my relatives were, and some still are, farmers. What we have to have are prices that can give farmers a profit. And that's going to take political leadership, tough political leadership. I have great respect for all of my colleagues on this stage, but there are some differences among us, and I think you're entitled to know that. I voted against the grain embargo of 1980. My friend Dick Gephardt voted for it. 1985 Farm Bill. I joined Tom Harkin, Chuck Grassley in voting against that bill that lowered farm commodities. Dick voted for that. We're not going to solve the problem of agriculture by eliminating farmers. We're going to do it by restricting supply and increasing demand. There's going to be no grain embargo in a Simon administration. I've been there fighting for farmers in the rural economy, not just election years. I've been there year after year after year, and I'll continue to be there. What a president has to do is to fight for the national interest. And part of fighting for the national interest is fighting for family farms and a healthier rural economy.
Thank you, Senator Simon. Reverend Jackson.
Thank you very much. We have a real challenge today, a choice between monopoly farming and family farming. This box of Wheaties costs about $1.25 in the store this morning. Farmers get less than 5 cents. I'm not running for Secretary of Agriculture, I'm running for President. I want to talk about the big picture for a moment. The real sense that prices are driven down, and then through the efficiency payments, we subsidize ConAgra and Cargill. They buy the grain cheap. We then take it to the elevator, which they control, the processing plant, which they control, the ships, which they control, then to Latin America, where they begin to dump these grains onto these markets and drive family farmers out of business in America as well as in Latin America, and then begin to import food back into this country subsidized by the U.S. government. We must look at the big picture. We need to have an international conference on food and agriculture and stabilize prices. We need to take a hard look at antitrust legislation or monopoly farming. I submit to you, it is easy to talk about program A, B, or C. We all care. We all want to make a difference in supply and demand. But I submit to you, my friends, this. If you go out tomorrow morning in your pond, assuming that it is thawed out, and your small fish have been eaten up, don't come to a Jackson administration looking for a grant to ask me, can small fish swim? You know small fish can swim. Let's look at the barracuda that ate those fish up in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, Reverend Jackson. Thank you, candidates. Helen Waller from Montana will ask the first question of all candidates. You each have 2 minutes to respond. And Senator Simon, we ask you to answer first.
Since 1980, market prices of major crops like corn and wheat have fallen, some by as much as 50%, while farm program costs have risen from $3 billion to more than $20 billion. Last year, American farmers were dependent on the federal treasury for almost half of their income. All of you have acknowledged the need for long-term government participation in the farm economy. Please explain how your farm program would provide for fair farm prices while reducing government costs.
In 2 minutes.
What we need are basically 2 things. One is good prices for farmers, and number 2 is genuine conservation. On getting good prices, we're going to have 2 things: supply management, and we're going to have to increase demand. On the supply management side, what we have to do is restrict in a way that restricts on the basis of bushels, bales, or pounds, not acres. What happens when we restrict on the basis of acres is we simply pour all kinds of chemicals onto the acres that we can produce. We then produce more on those acres, and we end up harming the soil and the water. The second side is on demand, and there are a variety of things that we have to do. We ought to be pushing exports more. Ronald Reagan has cut back on these people who in the Foreign Farm Service who sell for us. We also, for example, ought to be passing an ethanol bill that I'm the chief sponsor of in the Senate. Congressman Dick Durbin's the chief sponsor of in the House, and Dick Gebhardt and I do agree on quite a few things.
I'm glad of that.
And that's one we agree on. 7% of the gasoline now sold is 10% ethanol. We could gradually move that up to 50%. that would consume the 2 billion surplus bushels we now have. It would raise prices tremendously. But there are all kinds of things like that that need to be done. We need to push research, the right kind of research. And then, finally, we need to work on the whole soil conservation side of things, genuine conservation. Too many of the things that have gone under the name of conservation have not really been conservation.
Thank you, Senator Simon. Reverend Jackson.
Basically, I support the proposition for family farmers of fair prices, supply management, and return the land. A way to preserve our land is to have supply management so farmers will not be forced to exhaust the soil and poison the water. There must be some sense of balance. If we can bail out the farm credit system, and we are, and it's the right thing to do, then farmers who've lost their land to that system should likewise have their land returned on a long-term, low-interest basis. I believe in family farming as a way of preserving a way of life and the integrity of the agricultural process. The second part has to do with challenging the monopoly tendencies, that there might be greater competition among farming. And thirdly, our export markets. A few years ago, a third of our farm, of the Latin American grain market was U.S. grain. Now they cannot buy the grain, and we cannot sell it. So they starve while we have surplus, and then we go out of business. The reality is we ought to relieve their debt, reduce our deficit, and export to them grain and tractors and medicine and rail, rather than exchanging drugs for arms with the Contras. Next door we have 400 million neighbors, 400 million Latin American neighbors, allies, and customers. There is a market next door for grain, but not for war. President Reagan's answer in these low prices is to export the farmers. I say put a focus on saving the farmers, supply management, export President Reagan.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Reverend Jackson. Governor Babbitt.
I agree with Paul and Jesse that there really are markets out there. There really are. See, I have an optimistic view of the future of the family farm because I believe that with aggressive leadership we can develop world markets the way Jesse describes. I believe with Senator Simon that we can develop an extraordinary range of new uses in plastics, road de-icers, ethanol. Western cities are choking in smog. The only way to change that is to mandate the use of oxygenated fuels. Colorado has already done that. It's going to be required when I'm president in all of the major cities of the United States. So I think there's a market out there for that production if we're aggressive and imaginative and we recognize the opportunities. Now, how do you cut costs? Well, you cut costs by getting the corporate agribusinesses out of the program. You get them out. That 10% that's getting 50% of the benefits, you know how much benefits they ought to get? Somebody give me an answer. You got it. Now, that's how I'm going to save money, and it'll save so much money that I'll be able to move that loan rate, not down like the Reagan administration is doing it, but up. But not for the big guys, only for the family farmer. So I'm going to cut costs and get that support back up to the point where I'll say to Russ Anderegg, we're committed to keeping you in business and providing a fair return.
Thank you, Governor Babbitt. Senator Hart.
I suspect one way or another most of us here, most of us, not all of us, agree with basically the same outline of policies, some of those I mentioned in my opening remarks. We've come to the position of believing that producers ought to be able to reduce the surpluses that are choking prices and incomes to farmers. We certainly, many of us argued for long and hard over the past 4 or 5 years for emergency credit relief. We hope now we must press for the next year or so that relief program will be fairly administered and that restructuring of debts and fair credit terms can be offered. All of us, one way or another, for raising the standard of living in rural America, as I use the phrase, a level playing field, education, transportation, services basically, housing, and the rest, soil and water conservation. I think there are several differences, however, between my approach and my colleagues here. I feel very strongly, as I mentioned before, about this issue of protectionism. American farmers should not vote for protectionist policies or those who advocate them. It is disastrous. It's disastrous not only for the farmers and their children, but it's also disastrous for this country. We've never been a protectionist nation. When we've tried it, it's been a disaster for us and everyone we've dealt with. That is a major difference in this contest on the Democratic side. There's one other, at least where I'm concerned. What I've tried to do in formulation of policies is to try to get away from this political notion that there's a box of policies called farms and agriculture, another box called national economics, and a third box called international economics or foreign policy. The fact of the matter is, everything now relates. There's an interconnectedness between and among all these things. I believe very strongly the salvation for agriculture in this country is in trade. It is not in locking up our borders. Reverend Jackson mentioned the Latin American debt. He's absolutely right. I proposed several years ago in some of my policy statements a way to restructure that debt while we're restructuring farm debt here. We're not dumping agricultural products, Jesse, in Latin America. They want our products and can't afford to buy them. I think that's the difference.
Governor Dukakis.
I think this country has got to make a basic and fundamental decision. Are we going to get our farmers a fair price, which in practical terms means raising that loan rate and engaging in thoughtful and sensible supply management, or are we going to continue with a massive program of food subsidies, both here at home and abroad? I don't know of any other alternative to that. Are we going to continue to spend $20, $23, $26 billion a year subsidizing the price and the cost of food here in the United States and dumping overseas? Because that's basically what we're doing, and those practices are the same practices that we get very argumentative about when other people do them to us. Or are we going to try to achieve the kind of balance between supply and demand which can give our farmers a fair price, certainly the cost of production, and hopefully a modest return on their investment? I'm not sure as a nation we've made that decision. I'm not sure as a nation we've resolved it. For me, the notion of spending billions and billions to subsidize the cost of food just doesn't make any sense. Just doesn't make any sense. And that's why I think we're all for a combination of supply management and a reasonable level of price support. I think there are at least two other things that we can do, some of which have been mentioned here as well. One is interest costs. I met a young farmer the other day in Iowa who was paying 14% on his loans. 14% on his loans, and that's the direct result of failed and irresponsible fiscal policies that we've had for the past 7 years, beginning back in 1981. If we're going to get interest rates down, we've got to have a president who understands what strong fiscal and economic leadership is all about. That's the way we're going to get those interest costs down and help to relieve our farmers of the interest burdens that they have. And the other, of course, is expanding demand. And we've already heard some very creative and imaginative things that can be done. We're spending $800 million a year at the United States Department of Agriculture on research. 3% of it is for
Governor
new
Dukakis.
commercial uses for agricultural products.
Congressman Gephardt.
Well, this issue is the real test on farm policy, because the problem farmers have today is that they cannot get a price for their product. It costs $2.80 to make a bushel of corn, but a farmer today in Iowa gets about $1.50 for it, and a few months ago it was about $1. It would be like if you went to the restaurant and had a good meal and they brought you the bill and you said, well, I enjoyed the meal, but I think I'll pay about half the bill. That's all I want to pay. That's where farmers are today, because they have no help from the government in trying to set a price through the loan rate, and they have no supply management to try to back that up so that it can eventually happen. The Harkin-Gephardt bill goes directly to this question, and most importantly, it lets farmers decide what the farm policy should be. I'm tired of Cargill and fertilizer companies and ConAgra dictating what the policy should be. Why shouldn't the farmers be able to vote on what the policy should be? Now, on the issue of trade, obviously, in addition to getting a price for farmers, we've got to be able to get more of our product into the world. Senator Hart, I think maybe you're talking, when you talk about protectionism, you may be pointing at me, because some of the editorial writers around the country have wanted to use that word with my name.
Complex.
Well, well, let me tell you this. I think we got to get markets open, and I think we have to change the policy we have. I disagree with you. I don't think the law today is adequate. I think we've got to push markets open, and the only way we're going to do it is to engage other countries in an across-the-board negotiation on all the products that were excluded, that are excluded from their marketplace. So I want change. I want to stop foreign protectionism. And I don't think farmers should be satisfied just to sell grain. We should be able to sell processed foods and beef in other markets as well.
Thank you, Congressman Gephardt. Mr. Burkett will ask you candidates the second question. Each of you will answer that question in 2 minutes. Mr. Burkett, the question first to Governor Babbitt.
In July of last year, the Reagan administration proposed to get a 10-year plan to create a world market free in agriculture. All of you have rejected this proposal. What would be your approach to world trade talks on agriculture?
First of all, the Reagan proposal amounts to abandoning American agriculture. They keep talking about opening markets up, about freeing up the farmer. Their real agenda is to abandon the family farmer. What they're really telling you is they're going to walk away, and they understand the day will come when the result will be no family farms. And you'll drive across Iowa and you'll see a great big Tenneco sign from wall to wall, and in which all of the family farmers will be wearing straw hats as plantation employees. Now, that's what we're voting and fighting against. What is my export policy? 40% of what's grown in this state is exported abroad. And I think our policies have to recognize that that's an important piece of our agriculture. My reservations about Dick Gephardt's suggestions, so I haven't heard a good explanation of how it is it keeps us from losing, of why it is we won't lose those markets. You see, if we lose those markets under drastic cutbacks, what will happen to the John Deere plant? Their output will drop 30%. What will happen to all of the merchants and suppliers in the small towns of Iowa? Their sales will drop 30 or 40%. It'll contract our agriculture. We can't do that, because I believe agriculture's got a better future than drawing it down and losing all those markets and all those sales. I think the better approach is to structure a loan rate program focused on family farms, and then get aggressive about hanging on to that market, promoting it, promoting third world development in a way that'll create markets. Because you see, when world countries begin to develop, the food scale begins to go up, and there's more and more meat consumed and more demand. I think our kids have a tremendous shot at that market.
Thank you.
I think those mountains of corn can be turned into ethanol.
Thank
so
you,
we can
Governor Babbitt.
Find markets.
Governor Dukakis.
Well, I oppose the Reagan policy because I think it's totally unrealistic. I don't know of a nation in this world that produces food, and most of them do, that isn't going to try to develop or maintain a policy which preserves and strengthens their farms and food production. We all want that security. We all think it's important. And the notion that over the next 10 years somehow agriculture is going to be deregulated all over the world seems to me to be ludicrous and ought to be rejected out of hand. But there is a basic contradiction here, which I'm not sure anybody at this point has really dealt with. If we're going to get our farmers a fair price in this country, if prices in this country are at least going to cover the cost of production and hopefully provide some reasonable rate of return on a farmer's investment, then that means that our prices are going to go up. Now, if I understand correctly here, people are suggesting that the way you promote exports is essentially to subsidize your exports and dump them on the international market, and that's what we've been doing under this administration. We're in the middle of a fierce price war all over the world in which we keep driving down the price. Others try to undercut us. Governments all over the world are subsidizing exports to the tune of billions and billions of dollars, and I don't see that anybody's gaining. And that's precisely the kind of practice that we argue other nations are imposing or trying out on us, and we call it an unfair trade practice, and it is. So we're going to have to engage in some serious discussions with our trading partners and with the major food-producing nations on how we're going to make sure that prices all over the world are fair, that we do not any longer engage in what really has been a vicious price war, and by the way, a price war which isn't benefiting the United States. We're spending about $10 billion on farm subsidies in order to export about $3 billion worth of product in case of corn. Now that's terrific, isn't it? We're increasing the federal budget deficit. Our trade deficit is going up. That's the result of this policy.
Thank you, Governor Dukakis. Senator Simon.
Iowa farmers gave President Reagan a huge vote, a bonanza of votes, and this administration in return has offered bankruptcy to too many farmers. That's the reality. That was done in a variety of ways. Part of it was the 1981 Reagan tax bill that has caused much of the trade deficit. We have to move away from some policies of this administration. One of the things, and I mentioned this earlier, President Reagan has cut funding of the Foreign Agricultural Service that sells our products abroad. That doesn't make much sense. But the most important thing I think we can do is to enter into bilateral negotiations with other countries. I am all for the international agreements where we can work sensible agreements out, but the reality is what we just worked out with Canada. The details yet, don't know whether I'm for it or against it, but it is a quick way of getting something done. We're going to have to do the same thing with Japan, for example. You buy beef in Japan, it'll cost you about $40 a pound. The thing that is sold more at the Los Angeles airport for Japanese tourists than anything else are 10-pound boxes or bags of rice. We simply have to say to Japan, if you're going to send us your cars, you're going to send us other things, there has to be some reciprocity. And we're going to have to send you beef and pork and agricultural products from this nation. Trade has to be a two-way thing. And one of the things we can produce and produce in abundance in this country is agricultural production, and we ought to be selling it. We ought to be making sure we not only have volume, but we have dollars.
Senator Simon. Senator Hart.
Mr. Burkett, Mr. Reagan's utopian trade policy doesn't make any more sense than his Star Wars policy. We need international agreements, and that's why we helped establish the General Agreement on Trade and Tariff in order to regularize trade and set the terms and conditions by which nations would trade with each other. I don't think anybody believes, given national policies for self-survival in times of war, that we're ever going to eliminate government involvement in stabilizing and establishing agricultural production. I think GATT has to include agriculture, and as President, I would insist that it did. We're now negotiating a new round of trade agreements, and I think that round must include agriculture, and our leadership must insist on it. But we can have bilateral trade agreements nation by nation outside of GATT, and we do that. And contrary to what Congressman Gebhardt says, those agreements and the laws that we have do include sanction provisions. What's missing isn't the absence of sanctions. What's missing is strong leadership to enforce those sanctions. My trade policy and my trade bill, which predates Congressman Gebhardt's, takes away presidential discretion and requires the president, absent national security considerations, to impose trade sanctions against those who deal with us unfairly. That would alleviate the necessity or the temptation for the kind of unilateral protectionism that Congressman Gebhardt is proposing, and it would give American farmers and producers a chance to compete. It is in that arena that the future of this nation rests. We're not going to be able to isolate American agriculture from the world marketplace. Indeed, we have to jump with both feet into that world marketplace instead of put up trade barriers.
Thank you, Senator Hart. Congressman Gebhardt.
I think the first thing we have to look at is what this disastrous farm policy we have now has caused. Because we have low prices, we are exporting more to other countries, yet our farmers are getting less from those exports. Listen to these facts. 1986, we exported 73 million tons of agricultural products, and we got $9.7 billion from those tons. In 1987, we exported 90 million tons, but yet we only got $9.5 billion in return. And when you put in the $200 million of petroleum we imported to put into fertilizer to make those agricultural products, we lost $400 million on the deal. So we exported more, but we got less, and that's the whole point. Until American farmers get a fair price for their product, trade is not going to work to their benefit. So we got to handle that first. Second on trade. We do need a new policy, and I think my policy is that new policy. GATT, as important as it's been, hasn't worked. Last week we had a ruling from GATT that said that Japan should let in 10 agricultural commodities that they haven't been willing to let in. When the Prime Minister came here to talk to our President, the farmers in Japan demonstrated against the Prime Minister complying with that GATT ruling. And when the Prime Minister came here, he didn't agree to comply with that ruling. It's time to stop talking about one commodity at a time. We have to have bilateral negotiations on a whole range of commodities at once. We got to have Mr. Toyota talking to the farmers in Japan about what the trade policy in Japan should be.
Thank you, Congressman Gephardt. Reverend Jackson.
We obviously must have free trade, but the heart of free trade is fair trade. I went to Japan a couple of years ago, and before going, I met with some family farmers in South Carolina. The woman was going out of business, standing on the back of a tractor, crying and praying and having prayer and reading and singing hymns. He was standing on the back of a Yamaha tractor. When I got to Japan, there were key agricultural products that they would not allow in. That's unfair trade. But then we can negotiate fairness because our range of relationships are so broad. After all, we export more to Japan than we do to Great Britain, France, and Italy combined. So we should not be demagogic in this process. We need Japan, and Japan needs us. We're in a position with leadership to negotiate fairness and to make crooked ways straight. What we must address is that there is no free market. The U.S. sets the price for grain all around the world, and 4 conglomerates control 80% of that market. We're really not talking about Japan or Washington. We're talking about Cargill, Conagra, and the Barracudas. We must address that today. We need to stabilize supply management. That's why I support an international conference, have done so for 5 years now, an international conference on food and agriculture so as to stabilize prices and production around the world. OPEC essentially had to convene oil producers so as to have a sense of stable prices for oil producers around the world and a floor beneath which no producer will fall. We must have a floor beneath which no farmer in the world will fall. The most international aspect of American life is farming.
Thank you, Reverend Jackson. Excellent candidates. Thank you, all of you. The panelist questions will now be directed to a specific candidate. The first question will be from Mr. Weishauer to Congressman Gephardt.
Congressman Gephardt, in recent ads, you have been critical of corporate America. Today, Cargill and 4 other multinational grain companies control world markets and exports and exert tremendous influence over U.S. farm and food policy. Would you support the appointment of a special Justice Department task force to investigate possible antitrust violations by the multinational grain corporations?
Well, I'll do better than that. When I'm president, we'll have an attorney general that spends more time in the courtroom as a prosecutor than as a defendant. And the enforcement of the antitrust laws really starts at the top. It starts with the president, and it starts with your attorney general. If they aren't committed to enforcing the antitrust laws, and this president and this attorney general has not been, you wind up with the kind of concentration in the food industry and in other industries that we see today. What's happening? What's happening is that cheap grain prices are really what these giant corporations want, because they now have vertical integration. They're controlling all parts of the food industry. And so the thing they want most is cheap grain prices. That's what they've dictated in the farm policy we have. And then as they gain a greater concentration of power in their particular commodity, they have the ability to dictate to workers, to dictate to consumers, both the wages and the prices that they're going to pay or get. So there has to be not only a commission, there has to be an attorney general, but there has to be a new value sent from the White House, from the Oval Office to this country. And that new value is that we're not going to have concentration of power. That new value is that we're going to treat workers right. We're going to treat them as if they're an asset, not a bother. We're going to pay people fair wages. We're not going to try to ride over them and pull their wages down. And we're going to worry about the customer and the consumer. In short, we're going to make this country great again. Great because of the good products we make. Great because we have a team between labor and management to be excellent. And great because we have negotiated settlements with our trading partners so that we have access to their markets and they have access to ours. We can do these things if we stand up for change. We can't do them if we let the status quo go on. And the reason I'm running for president is because I want these policies to change. And I believe if we as Americans ask for it and demand it, we can get it done.
Congressman Gephardt, thank you. Miss Katie will direct her question to Reverend Jackson.
Reverend Jackson, all the Democratic candidates have talked about expanding the use of products like ethanol to increase markets and broaden agriculture's base. How would your administration direct agricultural research to find other new products?
First of all, a key factor in dealing with redirecting research is to commit ourselves to diversified family farms over these corporate feedlots. A key dimension to that is that of research. I put forth several weeks ago a 5-point package which would include fair crop prices and supply management, also fair dairy price and a quota system to allocate production to family farms, but also to shift federally supported research to family farm livestock production on family farms. And that would bring about the marketing of more quality food. It would increase and strengthen land stewardship, have a tremendous impact upon not exhausting our soil, as well as stop poisoning on the groundwater. A key to the progress we seek is to stop the conglomerates of the barracudas up top on the one hand, on the other hand, to strengthen family farmers by supply management, but also access to the best of research so they can take a marketable product. My friends, if we stop subsidizing the conglomerates and pauperizing the family farmers, if we begin to invest more in a moratorium on any further foreclosures and give these family farmers some breathing room and help to bail them out, and with good research, we can be, like our friend Willie Nelson says, back on the road again.
Thank you. Thank you, Reverend Jackson. Mr. Sidey will question Governor Babbitt.
Governor Babbitt, at the recent Des Moines Register debate, you rejected production controls, saying that production controls would raise farm prices and jeopardize export markets. Yet in your issue brief on farm policy, you call for a fair price to guarantee farmers the cost of production plus a reasonable return, and you advocate reduction of supply and increases in demand to eliminate bulging stockpiles. Do you favor higher prices for farm commodities and supply management or not?
I favor higher prices for commodities. I think there's a role for supply management in the form of the Conservation Reserve, the set-aside program that's already operating. Let me explain my question and my reservation about mandatory cuts. I recognize it's an appealing idea. I've already explained why it is I think that it could jeopardize our export markets and result in a 30 or 40% contraction of agricultural output, a reduction in the entire farm economy, the loss of a couple of million jobs in the farm supply industry, in the farm implement industry. And I think that's an awful risk to take when my approach guarantees prices without those risks. Now, the second problem with the mandatory production control approach is this. It continues to feed the barracuda because, you see, the benefits go not only to family farmers. Yeah, the barracudas. The barracudas get the benefit of all of those price increases as well. And I'm willing to say to the American people, sure, we should pay a little more for food. But I can't ask them to pay a little more for food in the context of a program that sends their increased prices to benefit corporate agriculture. So my question to you is, why not look at my program? I'm saying I'm going to take that loan rate program, I'm going to focus it just on family farmers, I'm going to starve the barracudas, get back to family agriculture, and send the loan rate not down, but up. Now that's my idea of a family farm program.
Thank you. Governor Babbitt. Mrs. Waller's question is directed to Senator Simon.
Senator Simon, you have stated that we need some form of supply management to get farm subsidies or some farm surpluses under control. What plan would you implement to accomplish effective supply management?
As I indicated in an earlier answer, I think it has to be on a bushels in the case of grain, bales in the case of cotton, and pounds in the case of dairy products, for example. We simply have to have that control not on the basis of acres. What happens in Iowa and Illinois if a farmer has 100 acres and you have 30 acres set aside? You pour all kinds of chemicals and you just increase that production on the land that you can produce on. We aren't going to solve our problem that way. We have to have supply management that says you can grow so many bushels and then you'll get the price. And as we do that, we're going to have a solid, sensible farm program. Let me, if I can, refer back to a question asked of Jesse in my remaining time here on this area of research. We're primarily doing agricultural research on producing more from the crops already in surplus. Just doesn't make sense. What we ought to be doing research on is on how we can have non-petroleum-based fertilizers. Because just as sure as I'm sitting here, at some point, the price of petroleum is going to go shoot through the ceiling again. We can do that. We can protect our soil better. We can do a variety of things. That's the kind of research that we ought to be pushing. I don't suggest that's a substitute for supply management. What we need is a good supply management, in the case of grains, based on bushels, and then we have to increase demand so we get prices up where they ought to be. And when that happens, agriculture is going to do better, and those rural communities that we haven't even talked about yet here, those rural communities are going to do better, and this nation is going to do much better.
Thank you, Senator Simon. Mr. Burkett will question Senator Hart.
Senator Hart, federally funded agricultural research has emphasized maximum production through capital, energy, and chemical-intensive methods. Given federal budget limitation, what research priority would you give your Secretary of Agriculture?
Well, first of all, I think with the exception of Governor Babbitt, to his credit, I'm the only person here, indeed, in the whole 13-person field who have put forward a budget. I've challenged all of our colleagues here to do so, and also the Republicans. First thing a president's going to have to do is draft a budget. Governor Babbitt's done it. I've done it. My budget shows not only how to get the Reagan deficits down by a whole variety of measures, but also how to invest in the projects this country has to invest in. Creation of the best education system in the world, job training, research, and rebuilding the public facilities of this nation. The Hart budget has an increase in agricultural research, along with energy, environmental research, general science and technology, and the rest. My agricultural budget research would go into finding out how to reduce input costs for farmers and how to use modern technologies to reduce environmental risks. One of the dangers I think we ought to worry about, given the Reagan legacy environmentally, of pollution of our air and our water and toxic waste and nuclear waste, is the downside or the dangerous side of new pesticide technologies and the rest. What we've got to do is use agricultural research to reduce those dangers, not only reduce cost to farmers, but reduce environmental dangers to farmers, their families, and consumers. I don't know how you're going to do that. I know all my colleagues are for all these great things. I don't know how you're going to do that unless you put a budget forward. Everybody's for education, everybody's for helping the farmers, everybody's for this, everybody's for that. Let's find out where the money's coming from. Let's find out whether we're going to have to raise taxes. And let's have the courage to deal straight and fairly with the people of Iowa and this country. And I don't know how else to do that except put forward a budget. That's what I've done.
Senator Hart, thank you. Mr. Weishaupt, you have a question for Governor Dukakis.
Governor Dukakis, blacks and other minorities in America have lost millions of acres of productive farmland in this century. A recent U.S. Civil Rights Commission report predicted the total elimination of the remaining 37,000 black farmers in America by the end of this century. What specific programs will you implement to assure blacks and other minority farmers access to land and retention of their existing land base? And will you support specific legislation such as a Minority Farm Act that would provide minority farmers access to land?
Access to what?
Access to land.
The same things that we have to do in this country to make farming and agriculture prosperous, to provide support for family farms, to do the kinds of things that we've been discussing this afternoon, are the things that are going to benefit minority farmers. If we can get prices up, if we can provide a strong and sensitive credit policy, if we can provide support for small and medium-sized family farmers, those policies will help all farmers, and they certainly will help minority farmers who, for the most part, are small, family-based, with small amounts of acreage. There are, I think, some special things that we can do to help minority farmers. I think it would be a tragedy in this country if the minority community lost its traditional involvement in some cases, leadership in agriculture. And I would want to reach out to minority farmers and minority communities to work with them on particular projects. I had a terrific afternoon with Jim Hightower in Texas a few months ago where I joined him as he was making a small grant to a predominantly black cooperative in Texas that, with the help of his department, was not only growing produce but marketing it directly to supermarket chains all over the Southwest, and doing so very successfully and very effectively. And they were making great progress in becoming direct marketers and putting that cooperative together. One of the other things, however, that we've got to do is to make sure that other policies do not put burdens on farmers, all of our farmers, and especially family farmers and minority farmers. At least three of the candidates up here support an oil import tax. I guess it's one of the ways that Senator Hart thinks we ought to pay for his budget. The oil import tax would not only impose a $50 billion burden on this nation's economy at a time we don't need it, can't afford it. About 2/3 of it would go to the oil companies, and it would impose almost $1 billion in additional costs on the farmers of this country. Now, one of the few breaks the farmers gotten in this country over the past few years has been lower energy costs. And here we are suggesting that we're going to impose hundreds of millions of dollars of additional costs on our farmers, on our manufacturers, on our homeowners, on elderly couples trying to heat their homes. There are dozens and dozens of ways to reduce our dependency on foreign oil, and one of them isn't an oil import tax. That's a bad policy for this country, and it will hit small and medium-sized farmers, including minority farmers, especially hard.
Thank you, Governor Dukakis. You have been, there will be an opportunity right now. You have been most gracious to respond to that ever-ticking clock, and I know that it's sometimes frustrating. But now each of you have 1 minute to respond to any of the issues raised by the panel or to respond to a statement made by any other candidate. And we will begin with you, Congressman Gephardt.
Let me pick up on the trade question because I think it's one of critical importance to farmers. I think we've got to change our trade policy so that we can get more of our farm products into other countries. And the problem I have with the present policy is that it's all targeted at complaining about unfairness in one area. The Gephardt Trade Amendment expands the discussion with another country to every problem we have with them. It's not mandatory. It doesn't require the President to put tariffs or quotas at all. It simply forces a discussion among all of the unfair practices that they're practicing. And to me, it's the only way we're truly going to get more of our products out there. Why should farmers be satisfied only selling grain to other countries? Why shouldn't we sell our value-added agricultural products, like processed foods and beef and other products that we make so well in the United States? So I'm not satisfied with where we are. I want us to have more access to other markets.
Thank you, Congressman Gephardt. Reverend Jackson.
I think the question about black land laws deserves at least a different answer. 926,000 black farmers in 1920, now about 37,000. First, these farmers need affirmative action. They have a double burden. They're not only small and family, but they're also black, which means often they cannot get loans. Often they cannot get access to the market. They need a strong affirmative action provision. Secondly, they need a commitment by the administration to give deference to the particulars of their predicament. Most of their land has not gone to other white farmers, which is the big racial playoff. It has gone either to the ConAgras of this world, or they have gone into some land bank. That's why I support the return of the land to those farmers who lost it, whether they are black or white, on a long-term, low-interest basis. It would be fair to say that black and white farmers finally must come together, because unless they rise together, they will simply undercut each other.
Thank you, Reverend Jackson. Governor Babbitt.
I'd like to follow up Reverend Jackson's remarks about small family farms, because I think we ought to all try to say, we're not only going to protect family farms, but we ought to put some incentives in the system to encourage more family farms, to see if we can't actually start a movement away from the consolidation of farms that has been built up over these Republican administrations. Now, mandatory production controls seem to result in the consolidation of agriculture. We've seen it in the 50% loss of small farms under the tobacco program. We've seen it in Canada under the milk program. We've seen it with rice and peanuts in the South. And rather than locking in the big farmers with guaranteed subsidies and prices that come from a mandatory program, I'd like you to think about how it is that a targeted loan rate program, with all of the big agriculture out, left to fend for themselves, creates a positive incentive for the return of small farms, because then it's the little guy who gets the government support.
Thank you,
and
Governor
nobody else
Babbitt.
gets it.
Senator Simon.
Comments in two quick areas. We talked earlier about research. One of the fundamental things that is wrong is that we are making a huge investment in this country into military research, how to build better and more accurate nuclear missiles and that sort of thing. We ought to be spending a lot more money in research and a lot of other things, including how we can use our productive capacity in this country. And then second, I would simply like to reinforce this need for enforcement of the antitrust laws. The antitrust laws are just a dead letter as far as this Justice Department is concerned. And let me tell you, it's hurting farmers now, and it's going to hurt farmers a lot more in the future. Fewer and fewer meat packers around. Where do you sell your hogs? Where do you sell your cattle? In the grain market. It's well documented what is happening out in the grain market. We have to have an administration that understands the letter of the law and the spirit of the law and then fights to see that our free enterprise system really is free. That's going to help farmers, that's going to help consumers, that's going to help everybody.
Thank you, Senator Simon. Senator Hart.
We've had a good deal of heated populist rhetoric here today about who's toughest on the great giant grain trading companies, and I can do it with the best of them. I think the real issue is how are people financing their campaigns and how have they voted in Congress where special interest legislation comes up. It's one thing to kick the grain companies around, it's another thing to take on corporate interests and giant interests and vote against your own self-interest. I'm not taking political action committee money because I think it's corrupting the system. We've got some people here who are and who voted with special interests in Congress time and time again. Where Mike Dukakis is concerned on energy, let me just say this, as an advocate of an energy independence policy. He must be getting his figures from the giant oil companies who don't want that oil import fee because they are net importers of oil and making a bundle on it. And Harvard University in his own backyard has said we're headed back to the bad old days of the 1970s and 50% or more reliance on imported oil. I don't know how many people in this audience have a 21-year-old son, but I do, and I don't intend to have my son die in an unnecessary war in the Persian Gulf fighting for someone else's oil.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Hart. Governor Dukakis.
Well, that's pretty good populist rhetoric, Gary, but I think it's a little bit beside the point.
It's also a fact.
What you're proposing is a $50 billion burden on this economy, both agricultural and manufacturing, at a time when we can't afford it and we don't need it. And a substantial portion of that burden will go into the pockets of the oil companies, but much of it will be borne by farmers and homeowners and workers, manufacturers. We will lose jobs. Farmers themselves will have additional $1 billion imposed on them. And to repeat what I said earlier, one of the few breaks the farmer's gotten in this country is lower energy costs. We have 300 years of coal in this country and clean coal burning technologies we can use right now. We've got 150 years worth of natural gas, one of the cleanest, one of the most efficient fuels. We've got a lot of gas-producing states that would love to provide that gas for the production of energy. We have opportunities for solar and renewable and cogeneration. We have, as we've heard today, billions and billions of bushels of corn that could be turned into ethanol mixed with gasoline and clean up our air and reduce our dependency on foreign oil. We do not need an oil import tax. It's a bad idea. It's something that will hurt the economy of this country and hurt the farmers of this country.
Thank you, Governor Dukakis. We've enjoyed the sparks of that round. Now, a deep breath. The next round, we will begin with Ms. Katie, who will direct her question to Governor Babbitt.
Governor Babbitt, you have stated your opposition to farm programs that would raise the market price of farm commodities. In recent years, the prices of many farm commodities have been well below farmers' cost of production. How would you keep family farmers on the land producing at prices below their costs of production without expensive government deficiency payments, such as made through the target price and market loan programs?
Well, you see, I've already explained to you that I believe that the loan rate support ought to be withdrawn from the big farmers. That's how I'm going to save money, and that's why I'm going to raise loan rates for family farmers. But you see, that also has another effect, because if you pull the loan rate out from under those big producers, I think they're going to be a little bit less eager to plant to the horizon. They're going to start thinking about costs and prices, and I believe that some of that production will tail off precisely because I'm no longer spending your money to reward them for making an irrational economic decision. That's why it is, I think, it's important to target the support on family farms. Now, if I might, I'd kind of like to go back to Gary and Mike for just a moment. Gary, you've produced a budget, but Mike's right. Your oil import fee is the most regressive tax in the whole world. And whether or not the oil companies like it, they're getting the goods. They're getting 2/3 of it. And I think you ought to go back and find a real revenue source. Now, Mike, you've told us what you're against. But you haven't told us what you're for, and I'd like to see a budget. And then I'll be back to mix it up again.
You'll have one more opportunity, Governor. Mr. Seide will question Congressman Gephardt.
Congressman Gephardt, even opponents of your Family Farm Act admit that it would be the lowest cost alternative and would raise farm income. However, your proposal has been criticized by the U.S. Department of Agriculture and others who claim it would reduce U.S. farm exports. How do you respond to their criticism?
Well, first of all, the studies that have been done by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, I think, are suspect, to say the least. In fact, I think the effect and the influence of the big grain cartels and the big grain companies have been felt in the last 7 years on the Department of Agriculture. So I don't much believe their studies. But let me say this about exports and what my bill, I think, does with exports. As I said a minute ago, we have increased exports in the last year, but we did it by getting less value back to the family farmer. I don't think that's a policy that works. The administration keeps saying, let's get more export out into the world market, and that'll help us ultimately. But if you're sending it out at a low, low price, then the farmer is not getting a return, even a return sufficient to cover their cost of production. So the Harkin-Gephardt bill gets prices up. Then it asks the president and the trade negotiators to go to other countries and to try to reach sensible agreements so that we have world prices and supply management around the world so that farmers everywhere can make a living. I don't want to break farmers anywhere. And why should we be using food as a weapon to cut prices for farmers in other countries? And one other thing, you know, low prices really don't mean that people are not able to have good food. We've got counties here in Iowa where we have the highest hunger rate of any place in the United States. And these are counties where there is tremendous production of agricultural products at a low price. So the low price isn't helping the consumers, it isn't helping the farmers, and it doesn't help the farmers in those other countries. So what I look forward to is negotiation in order to get the same kind of price levels and the same kind of supply management around the world so that farmers everywhere, not just in America, can do well.
Thank you, Congressman Gephardt. Mrs. Waller, your question goes to Reverend Jackson.
Reverend Jackson, during the farm crisis of the 1980s, millions of acres of farmland have come under the control of lenders, outside investors, and large corporate operators. You've already told us about the Barracuda syndrome. But I would like to know what specific ways that you would propose to get this land back into the hands of the working family farms.
First of all, the family farmers lost it in a systemic crisis. If we had lost 60 farmers or 600 farmers, you could say it was a personal crisis. They were driven out as prices were driven down and the conglomerates were able to deficiency payments to get subsidized while these farmers got pauperized. They were victims of a system. If they didn't farm, unless they farmed, they could not get the subsidy. If they farmed, they drove prices down. Now we've had to bail out the farm credit system, which I agree with. But then if we can bail out the farm credit system and bail out Chrysler and Japan because of systemic problems and bail out Europe and Japan, let's bail out the family farmer. It's a part of the same basic commitment to correct errors when we find deficiencies. For that land that is now in the land bank, farmers, beginning farmers, minority farmers, and farmers who want to regain their land should be able to get their land back at long-term, low-interest loans. Those who have tilled the soil, who cultivated the soil and made America's farm system the best in the world, ought to have first access on getting their land back.
Thank you, Reverend Jackson. Mr. Burkett, you have a question for Senator Simon.
Senator Simon, this question comes from the Federation of Southern Cooperatives. The new Farm Credit Act should correct past abuse by both the Farmers Home Administration and the Farm Credit System. But many farmers I work with are concerned that they will not implement the borrower rights section of this law. Many farmers in Mississippi still cannot get farm operating and land ownership loans. What steps would you take as president to address these credit problems faced by family farmers across America?
First, the bill that passed is a good bill. It is a step in the right direction. And in addition to every other step, if we don't get prices up, we can have all kinds of fine regulations and statutes passed. We're not going to help the farm credit system appreciably. There are things in that bill that follow the leadership. Frankly, here in Iowa, and as I recall, Minnesota, you had the mediation service in Minnesota along with Iowa. That is a step in the right direction. But a very fundamental thing, and this is why it is important to have a President of the United States who understands rural America and what rural America is all about. What we need are people out there for the Farmers Home Administration and the various farm credit agencies who really are going to try and help farmers. And I don't need to tell this audience that is not the case in too many cases today. That's not a hint to me back there. Jesse, you've been talking about the barracudas. One of the barracudas, I regret to say, out there for farmers has been the United States government. That is one of the realities. And what we have to have is a President of the United States who sends a very, very clear signal to everyone working for the Farmers Home Administration and the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the various credit agencies. Your job is to help family farmers and protect farmers. We need the right signal from the top. My hope is that under this administration, despite this administration, we'll get a favorable response. The law is very clear. It is good. But we need a president who really understands rural America and who's going to fight and lead for rural America.
Thank you, Senator Simon. Mr. Whiteheart will question Senator Hart.
Senator Hart, while hunger remains a problem in countries around the world, and considering the U.S. grain surplus, how would you propose to address the hunger issue without disrupting third world efforts toward food self-reliance?
Well, it's an important question because a lot of Americans don't understand it. All of us have traveled the country, and in my travels, urban people particularly say, we've got these huge surpluses, there are hungry people at home and abroad, why don't we just feed them, help the farmers, and help the people in foreign countries? What we've come to realize is that a number of those foreign countries must become and can become reasonably agriculturally self-sufficient. Now, we ought to help them in the meantime. Their people shouldn't starve while they're getting on their feet. But the goal in those countries where the geography and the climate permits is to help them through agricultural technology and assistance and experts become as self-sufficient as they can to feed their own people. And we shouldn't undermine their ability to create that agricultural self-sufficiency. Now, there are nations in the world, in the third world, that don't have those conditions and cannot become enough agriculturally self-sufficient to ever feed all their people. There, I think, traditional food programs and new food programs can be used not only to work down our own surpluses, but to meet the moral demand of ending hunger. What I would like to do is to challenge Mr. Gorbachev in January of 1989 to join us in a joint humanitarian commitment to end world hunger by the year 2000. We can do that starting here at home, and together we can do it around the globe. Our farmers, the most efficient producers in the world, certainly more than the Russians we've come to learn, we ought to direct and target our assistance into those areas. One final comment. I traveled to Central America in 1983. What I found in Honduras, El Salvador, and other nations were farmers in those villages and outside those villages with per capita incomes in the range of $400, $500, or $600 per year. And while American Army bulldozers and machines and engineers were building runways and defense establishments to support the Contra War, illegal Contra War, which ought to be ended, those villagers were standing there watching, wondering why we couldn't provide the same assistance to help them elevate their crop production, build roads to get their crops to markets, build schools and hospitals and medical centers for their children, and generally help them raise their standard of living. In my judgment, that would not only save us a lot of dollars, It would also frustrate communism and end up saving American lives in potential wars in those regions of the world. So I would say, in terms of our food surpluses, let's target them on the countries that cannot become agriculturally self-sufficient, and other nations that can. Let's send them our technical assistance. Let's send some Iowa farmers. Let's send some Colorado farmers to help those farmers increase their crop production and feed their own people.
Thank you, Senator Hogg. Back to Ms. Cady, who will direct a question to Governor Dukakis.
Governor Dukakis, increasing farm prices could result in an increase in supermarket prices. You're from one of the most urban states in the nation. How do you talk about this with the people of Boston?
Thoughtfully and well. And let me say this. You know, the people from my part of the country care very deeply about the farmers of Iowa and the farmers of the heartland of this country. I remember when those news reports first came on television, and we saw farm families having their farms taken away from them. There was enormous sympathy and support for people in the Northeast and all over this country. The family farmer has great support all across this country, whether it's east, west, north, or south. And I think that's something that we all ought to bear in mind. We care about family farmers. We care about the future of agriculture. We do not want the production of food in this country to become the province of corporations and conglomerates. And we will support policies that do that. Now, what is happening? And I'm, in a sense, repeating what I said a few minutes ago. We've decided, I guess as a nation, temporarily, I hope this is going to change in January of 1989, that we're going to engage in a massive program of food subsidies. It's really what's happening here. It's really what's happening here. And instead of trying to provide our farmers with a fair price that at least covers the cost of production and hopefully does a little more, what we are now doing is subsidizing to the tune of $20 to $25 billion the cost of food in this country and, of course, some of our exports. I don't believe the people of my region of the country want food subsidies. I think we're prepared to pay a reasonable price for food. And since that $20 to $25 billion is adding to a massive federal deficit, which we all know is causing great economic uncertainty and having a devastating effect on our ability to build a strong and vibrant economic future for our country, it doesn't help us as consumers to be engaging or spending our tax monies on those kinds of subsidies for the sake of a few pennies more on a loaf of bread or on a box of cereal. And I think we all know that only 25% of what we're paying in the supermarket gets back to the farmer anyway on average, so we're not talking about vast increases here. So I think the people of this country are prepared to pay reasonable prices for their food that will at least provide for a fair price for farmers. And I think if given the choice, they'd rather have that than another $20 to $25 billion on a federal deficit that is already too big, is raising interest rates to farmers and homeowners and first-time home buyers and all kinds of people in this country that would benefit from lower interest rates. And in reducing that deficit would move us a lot farther on the road toward general prosperity for all of us.
Thank you. Thank you. Governor Dukakis. Now, the next one of those one-minute rounds when you can respond either to questions already asked or respond to answers given by another candidate. And we will begin with you, Governor Babbitt.
Mike, I only wish that 25% of what I pay for my food were actually going to the people who grow it.
Depends on what you're buying.
I think that a lot of our discussion today has been characterized by differing views about the future. My view of the future of this farm belt is optimistic. I believe we're going to see the day when our kids are eager to come back to a farm because they'll know that there's a real price in an expanding market. My view of this matter is simply this. There are markets out there, and we ought not to be talking about contraction, about losing jobs and shrinking the economy. We ought to be looking out there aggressively at world markets, at uses, at ethanol. And, you see, my farm plan talks about maintaining prices by targeting that loan rate, by saying the loan rate's only available to family farmers. It does a lot of good things. It gets the big guys out. It will help the supply side because they won't make so many supply side decisions when they don't have that government subsidy. And it will foster a return to family farms because the only support will be a family support, and we'll get some motion back to a real strong, vibrant farm economy.
Thank you, Governor Babbitt. Congressman Gephardt.
I'd like to talk again about food prices to consumers. You know, in the last few years, prices for farmers have been going down and farmers have been going broke. But I haven't noticed any of the prices in the grocery store going down. And that really is the point. There's so little of what a farmer makes in any product we buy that you can double what the farmer's getting and it isn't going to affect consumers that much. In fact, the studies we've seen at the University of Missouri and Iowa State say that Harkin Gephardt would only increase consumer prices by 7% over 10 years. And one other thing, you know, I think the John Deere workers and the J.I. Case workers, or at least the ones that used to be there in the Quad Cities, wouldn't mind paying 2 or 3 cents more for a box of Wheaties if they still had a job at their plant in the Quad Cities.
Thank you, Congressman Gephardt. They don't stop by themselves very often. Reverend Jackson.
He ran out of something to say. I want to pick up on the spirit of his conclusion. One thing that we must do as Democrats is to stop the rural farmer, urban consumer playoff, which keeps both of them weak. Rural farmers, when they're asked for fair prices and supply management and return of their land, are right. Urban consumers who are asking for fair wages and markets and return of their jobs are right. And they must come together. Urban consumers must know that they're not paying higher prices because farmers are taking something from them. As a matter of fact, farm prices have gone down, consumer prices have gone up, and so farmers and urban consumers should not be fighting each other. They should come together on the Barracuda, because that's who's jamming the both of them. It's GM and GE in the cities and Conagra and Cargill in the countryside. Therefore, never again should we allow race and sex, and religion and region and a few pennies to separate us from each other. Farmers and workers united will never be defeated. That becomes our challenge.
Thank you, Reverend Jackson. Senator Simon. Senator Simon.
First, I want to say to Jesse, if he paid $1.25 for this little box of Wheaties, he's going to the wrong grocery store, I'll tell you.
Oh, Paul.
But I'd like to underscore a point. I'd like to underscore a point that Jesse made that I think really is important, because frequently in these discussions we pit farmers against consumers. We're in this ball game together. Fortunately, consumers in the United States pay less as a percentage of our income for food than people in any other country. And with the exception of the people who unfortunately are falling through the cracks under this administration, and there are far too many of them, by and large, Americans live better than anyone else. But let me just say to consumers who may be watching this, if you think farm prices or grocery prices are too high now, you get rid of the family farm, and you see that family farm diminish more and more, and you just wait to see what happens to prices. I think Americans understand that.
Thank you, Senator Simon. Senator Hart.
We are here today to speak to farmers, but Ms. Katie raises a very important point, and that is our willingness to speak for farmers, because that's what a president must do. What I've tried to do as I've traveled the country, and particularly as a product of rural America, is to speak to urban audiences, non-farmers, consumers, about the plight of the farmers, not only in Iowa and Colorado, but across this country, and make the very valid point, very Jeffersonian point that Paul Simon makes. Consumers have an interest in preservation of the family farm. Let the productive farmland of this country fall into the hands of a couple of dozen giant corporations, and then the consumers are going to find out what high prices are. And I've tried to bear that message to the urban dwellers of America, the 3/4 or more who live in cities, who consume the products of this land and the state that I come from. I find them willing to listen. I find them willing to accept. In fact, I find them cheering a proposal that will keep a broad base of family farm ownership and production in this country, not only in their interest, but in the interest of a solid American economy that is self-sufficient in food production. That must be a goal of the next administration.
Thank you, Senator Hart. Governor Dukakis.
Well, let me continue with this theme. Dick talked about those workers in the Quad Cities that have lost their jobs and what would have happened if we had a healthy, growing agricultural economy. Remember, too, that the steel for those tractors is made in Pittsburgh. The fuel that is used to fuel those forges comes from Texas. The computers that make sure that that steel is of first-rate quality come from my part of the country. All of us benefit in an economic sense, as well as the people of one nation, when our farm economy is growing and expanding and is vibrant, and when our family farms are thriving and prospering. And I think that's something that the American people instinctively understand. It's very, very important. None of us gain from what has been happening. And as candidates for the presidency, we do have a responsibility to take that message to every corner of this country. But I think the people of this country understand it, they sympathize with it, they support it. They know that their future, their jobs, their prosperity depends on a prosperous and healthy farm economy.
Thank you, Governor Dukakis. And you've all been so kind to follow the clock that in the final round of questions, we're going to give you 1.5 minutes to respond. Mr. Saide, your question is directed to Reverend Jackson.
Yes. This question comes from rancher John Stolt from Lamar, Colorado, on behalf of the Rocky Mountain Farmers Union. Reverend Jackson, he says cheap feed grains have severely undercut the value of our grass and hay here in Colorado. Cattle prices have been pretty strong, but with the experts say the cattle market cannot hold up past this year. What would be your policies, and what would your policies do to stabilize the livestock industry at a profitable level?
First of all, just to expand upon his own observation, in the last 10 years, 65% of the cattle growers in this state are now out of business. The same is true for dairy farmers, hog farmers. Because we were involved, we made 5 recommendations. One, that we should have fair crop prices and supply management and return the land. That is a key to it. Secondly, fair dairy prices, just as we have fair prices for other products. A shift in the research from just large federal funding to that of livestock producers and family farmers. The third, to revamp the federal poultry inspection system as well, but above all, enforce antitrust legislation on these conglomerates who stand to gain by keeping grain and feed prices down. When they keep the prices down, they keep the farmers down, the dairy farmer down, the poultry down, eventually drive them from their land. I repeat again, I've said it all day today, I'm very concerned about a few companies controlling, in the real sense of being subsidized by the government, and then they control the elevator, they control the processing, they control the shipping, they control third world countries, they end up controlling us all. We must have a commitment to an effective livestock program.
Thank you, Reverend Jackson. And Mrs. Waller, your question to Congressman Gephardt.
This question comes from Francis Horrigan, a dairy farmer who chairs the Vermont Senate Agriculture Committee. Congressman Gephardt, on January 1st, dairy farmers took a 50-cent per hundredweight cut in milk prices, which is one more in a series of price cuts required by the 1985 Farm Bill. These cuts are based on the theory that if we lower the price far enough, farmers will stop producing so much milk. Do you believe in the theory that lowering farm prices is an effective supply management tool? And if not, what would you do to balance supply and demand in the dairy industry?
Well, the situation in dairy is much like other commodities, and what we've done with the present farm program is that we are trying to get price down. I disagree with that. The Harkin-Gephardt bill has a specific section that affects dairy farmers. First, they can vote on whether or not they want a higher price and greater supply management. I suspect that dairy farmers would vote for that in Vermont and all across the country. And incidentally, in Vermont and New York, dairy farmers are going out of business at a faster rate than almost any place in the country. So I think farmers would vote for that. If they do, then we set the rate up, the support rate up, they get a higher price. We would engage in greater supply management, and we would keep dairy farmers in business. The present policy, I think, it's not announced, but I think the present policy is to get rid of dairy farmers. I don't like that policy. I don't think American consumers should like that policy. And when I'm president, we'll pass the Harkin-Gephardt bill and we'll turn that around.
Thank you, Congressman Gephardt. Mr. Burkett, your question to Governor Babbitt.
Governor Babbitt, there is currently a proposal in Congress to raise excise taxes on consumer goods and services, such as gasoline, diesel fuel, tires, batteries, alcohol, tobacco, and telephone services. Do you support an increased excise taxes as a means of raising revenue?
Well, I am one candidate who has tried to be honest about these issues, because I believe that we're not going to have a farm economy, we're not going to have a strong, growing, prosperous American economy unless we deal with this budget deficit honestly. Now, we have to do that by talking about what programs we would cut, not across the board, but in a way that preserves the important programs. And I think we need to be honest about raising revenue. Now, we've had a discussion about the oil import fee. I think it's the most regressive tax of all, and that it sends the benefits to the oil companies. Excise taxes that you suggest are a partial response. But I'll tell you frankly, if we're serious about our economic future and about the programs we care for and about reversing the destruction of help for those who really need it and creating a real future, we've got to be a little more honest about this issue of taxes. I advocate a progressive consumption tax. Now, Mike Dukakis is going to jump in right here and say it's not a progressive tax.
Governor Babbitt.
It is.
Thank you.
Because
thank you.
You exempt poor people from the
Governor
impact of the
Babbitt,
tax.
thank you. Mr. Weishauer's question to Senator Hart.
Senator Hart, the average migrant farm worker family survives on an income of less than half the federal poverty level. They often live in substandard housing with inadequate health care. They are exposed daily to highly toxic chemicals, sometimes without adequate protection. What would you do to improve the situation of American farm worker families?
I think there have to be national standards strictly enforced by the federal government to protect the well-being of migrant workers in this nation. That includes their housing and shelter, care for their children and education of their children, health standards in terms of their working conditions and opportunities for decent standard of health care, and overall supervision of those that employ them to make sure they're not being taken advantage of. I'll say something here that probably is not totally acceptable to everyone, but I favor raising the minimum wage in this country. Unlike others here who voted against raises in the minimum wage, I think it ought to be $5. I think we ought to get people on to work and off welfare. And I think one way to do that is to give them a decent compensation. Right now, there are tens of millions of Americans who can work at the minimum wage, 40 hours a week, 52 weeks a year, and still be well below poverty. That is unacceptable. We're going to have to raise the floor of income and standard of living for the people who have been left out and are at the bottom of the ladder. And we can start with the migrant workers and others who are on the very fringe of our society in terms of both the income they have and the protections they have. That is the federal government's responsibility.
Thank you, Senator Hart. Miss Katie's question to Senator Simon, please.
This question comes from the Land Stewardship Project headquartered in Stillwater, Minnesota. Senator Simon, federal farm policies that encourage maximum production often conflict with environmentally sound farming practices, thereby penalizing farmers who are good stewards of the land. How would your program address this conflict?
As I indicated earlier, I think we have the wrong kinds of conservation programs. And ultimately, we're going to be reading, maybe early in the next century, not about a shortage of oil, not about a shortage of water. I'm not suggesting there aren't serious problems in both areas, we're going to be reading about a shortage of topsoil. And we ought to be doing everything we can to preserve that for future generations. And we're doing an inadequate job of it now. That clearly has to be one of the two priorities. Number one, prices that can give farmers profits, and number two, genuine conservation. And I think those genuine conservation programs have to be tied in with farm payments. Here, I think we have to recognize one of the inequities. Bruce has referred to it. 72% of the farmers earn less than $40,000 a year. They get less than 10% of the farm payments. 1.3% of the farmers earn more than $500,000 a year. They get 13% of the farm payments. We have to have more sensible policies and policies that encourage genuine conservation.
You can continue that in your final statement. Mr. Sidey, you have the last question to Governor Dukakis.
Governor Dukakis, rural economic development has become a buzzword in this campaign. Everyone seems to be for it. I would like to get more specific. How do you define rural economic development? Does it mean federal aid or tax incentives to a Fortune 500 company to locate in a farm state? Does it mean similar aid for a big shopping mall that will compete with small town stores? And what about the wage level and the quality of those jobs we seek to create in rural America?
Society, in my state, there's a county which is called Franklin County. Its county seat happens to be Greenfield. Not exactly the same mix, but we both have a Greenfield and we both have a Franklin County. Unemployment in that county and some of its towns in 1982 was 18, 20, and 22%. Today it's 3.5%. That's because of a focused, effective program of rural and small-town economic development. I propose the creation of a National Economic Development Fund of $500 million, 1/7 of what we're spending on Star Wars. $100 million of that to be focused in on the special problems of rural America. Loans, grants to expanding companies, to new companies, most of them small and medium-sized, that create good jobs at good wages, not minimum wage jobs, an opportunity to rebuild the infrastructure of rural America, to provide training, all of the things that go into sound and effective rural development. I've seen it work. It's worked in my state. It's worked in other states. It can work here in the heartland of America.
Thank you. Thank you, Governor Dukakis. The time has gone quickly. Now you have the opportunity for 2 minutes, your last shot at this wonderful Heartland audience and all of those watching us today. And we will begin with Senator Simon.
Those who wrote our Constitution had a dream to form a more perfect union. It is very interesting in the rural communities in which we live, and we really didn't talk much until your final question about rural economic life outside of agriculture. In small communities, we learn to care about each other. And that's one of the things we have to learn as a nation once again, with a president who really leads us. But we also have to recognize the economic importance of agriculture. And we're not just talking about farmers. We're talking about a lot of other people. Chief Executive Officer of Navistar, used to be International Harvester, was in my office. I asked him, how many people did you employ 4 years ago? He said 97,000. I said, how many people do you employ today? He said 15,000. Those aren't farmers, but they understand what is happening to rural America. And so do I. I've milked cows, I've baled hay, I live in rural America. I understand what is happening, and I understand we can do infinitely better. And I have been there helping rural communities and farmers, not just in election years. I've been there year after year after year, and I will be, no matter what position I hold in their fighting for farmers. What you want in a president is someone who has a vision of a better nation and a better world. Part of that vision ought to be a healthy agriculture and a healthy rural life. If you want someone as president who understands rural America, who lives in rural America, and who is willing to lead for a better rural America, I stand ready.
Thank you, Senator Simon. Governor Babbitt, your closing statement.
We've had a good debate, and I think it should be clear that all of us share the same goals and provide a much, much better alternative than the disaster of the last 7 years. But the plain fact is that I've tried to explain to you tonight that I have a different view, that I want to be frank about telling you that the mandatory production controls embodied in the Gephardt approach, I think have serious problems, and I must tell you I can't support that approach for 3 reasons. Yeah, I understand that, I do have a different view and that you do feel strongly, but I didn't come here to pander to the prevailing view. I came here to try to be honest about why I'm different. I think that approach risks destroying our export markets. That means an enormous contraction in agriculture. It means that 40% of the land in this state will go out of production. And it means that the farm suppliers and the implement makers and the entire economy of the Farm Belt will begin to shrink by 30 to 40%. I worry about the fact that the benefits in the form of increased prices go not only to family farmers, but they go to all those agribusinesses all over the United States. It entrenches their power, rewards them, provides them the base from which to expand their grip on American agriculture. I understand that that's the prevailing wisdom, and I respect that. But what I've tried to do is tell you that I see a different future. It's a future based on optimism. I believe that your kids out there all over this state face an optimistic, expansionist future, that we can find markets, that your kids are going to come home from states all over the Union to a prosperous future with expanded trade, larger markets, new products, and that in the meantime, we can keep the family farms safe and prosperous and provide income by targeting the resources we do have on family farms. That's my plan. I hope you'll consider it. Thank you very much.
Governor Babbitt. Governor Dukakis.
I'd like to end my portion of this discussion by saying thank you once again to the farmers and the farm families and the people of Iowa, of its cities and rural towns, and of its farms and farm communities. This has been a wonderful experience for me and my family, and when somebody asks you if we ought to begin in Iowa and begin with these caucuses, you tell them that the guy from Massachusetts deeply believes that this is one of the most important experiences he's ever had. I, too, am an optimist. I think we can build a future for this country and for its farmers and rural communities and cities as well that is bright and vibrant and promising and growing, that will create economic opportunity for every single one of our citizens. I'm committed to that. I bring a record of economic growth and development and achievement to this race, and I hope you'll support me. But we also live in an increasingly smaller and more complex world. And the next President of the United States is also going to have the opportunity to shape a foreign policy that reflects American values. That's important to the people of this country. It's important to the people of rural America. A president who is committed to ending Contra aid and ending our failed and illegal policy in Central America. A president who will take advantage of the best opportunity we've had for meaningful arms control and arms reduction and a halt to the arms race in generations. I want to be that kind of president. And with your help, I want to go to the White House and build a more stable and a more peaceful world, a prosperous America, one in which every citizen in this country enjoys the American dream and does so for himself or herself and their family and for their community. Thanks for having us. This has been a good afternoon, and I've enjoyed it.
Thank you, Governor Dukakis. Senator Hart.
My family and I are glad to be back. As I said in this state 2 years ago, my foreign policy can be compressed into 3 words: price, price, and price. But I would like to talk to Iowans today, not as farmers, but as Americans and citizens of the world. You are going to select not a Secretary of Agriculture. There are others here probably more qualified for that than I am, and I'll certainly keep them in mind. You are going to select the President of the United States and the leader of the free world. You're concerned not only with our foreign policies, but whether or not we have taken the trouble, had the courage, not only to have a vision, but to spell that vision out. A vision of restructuring this nation's economic foundation, investments in food and energy production, in our manufacturing base, most of all in the education and training of our children and our workers. A vision that incorporates the domestic economy into the world marketplace. that resists the temptation of protectionism for short-term political gain in the interest of opportunity for ourselves and other people around the world for long-term human gain. A vision of a foreign policy that engages us in the third world instead of as the policemen, rather as the helpers and the friends of emerging nations. And finally, a vision that addresses the realities of defending ourselves in a dangerous era by meeting the Gorbachev challenge of reducing nuclear weapons and reforming this nation's defenses. I think you want leadership that not only tells you what it stands for and how to get there, but also how to pay for it. That's why I put a budget out. That's why I think everyone running for president ought to put a budget out. What we're doing here is seeking your support, because America cannot be strong without a strong farm base. But a strong farm base cannot be strong without a strong America. That's what the issue is. The issue is to integrate this nation's economy into the world marketplace, to give opportunity for American farmers, American workers, and American young people. That is my policy, and that is why I need your help.
Thank you, Senator Hart. Congressman Gephardt, please.
As we end this debate, I'm reminded that a lot of people want us to believe today that the farm crisis is over. The Wall Street Journal the other day loudly proclaimed that. But I don't think the farm crisis is going to end until the family farmers get a chance to decide what the policy should be. A lot of farmers say to me, I like the Harkin-Gephardt bill, but I don't think they'll let you pass it. Well, I'd like to ask who they is. I think I know who they is. They is the establishment. It's the Reagan administration. It's the big grain companies that like the status quo and don't want anything to change. And you've got to understand that this is an economic battle. It's a fight between people who have one set of interests and people who have another set of interests. And many of you may think that you can't match that other set of interests, that you don't have the power, you don't have the influence that the other side has. Well, don't you believe it. You don't have to accept a definition of progress that says the family farm has to die, or that rural schools have to close, or that young people have to leave Iowa to find jobs somewhere else. You can change things, but Tom Harkin and I and the others that support the bill can't do it alone. We need you. On February the 8th, your voice is going to be as powerful as anybody's voice in this land. And on February the 8th, if you'll stand up with me, we can confound the critics, we can surprise the establishment, and we can let family farmers decide their future again. This has been my fight, and I hope it's your fight too. Thank you very much.
Reverend Jackson. Reverend Jackson, please.
You're told that you cannot win, and that is not true. You're told that you can win alone, and that is not true. It's been said I cannot win, and that is not true. The fact is, there is no farm solution to the farm problem. There's a political solution, a coalition solution to the farm crisis. The fact is, you must allow your interests to converge with other people who have the same or similar predicament. Urban workers were fighting for fair price, fair wages are right. It's not enough of them. You want fair prices, but it's not enough of you. When I was growing up, my grandmother could not buy a blanket. She could not afford credit. She'd take out strips of old cloth, coats and shirts and dresses and sheets, and lay them on the bed or lay them on the cot. And while they were apart, they were just rags, hardly fit to wipe off your shoes with. They had no function. But that old woman would take her strong hands and hard, strong string, a cord. She would turn those rags and strips into a quilt, a thing of beauty, a thing of power. Farmers, you're right, but your patch ain't big enough. Workers, you're right, but your patch ain't big enough. Women who want higher minimum wage and pay equity, you're right, but your patch ain't big enough. Youth who want scholarships as opposed to, you're right. Those who want peace in Central America and freedom in South Africa and peace in the Middle East, you're right, but your patch ain't big enough. But friends, If we put those patches and pieces together, a rural, urban, black, white, brown coalition, if we turn to each other and not on each other, we can win. Today you've given me the most cheers. February 8th, give me the most votes, and we'll show them how. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Reverend Jackson. I would like to thank all of you. I would like to thank all of you as candidates. You've been most gracious, the panelists, for participating in this forum, and certainly you as an audience. I would like to extend our appreciation to the Iowa Farm Unity Coalition, the League of Rural Voters, and the Prairie Fire Rural Action for sponsoring this forum, and other contributing sponsors, including the American Agriculture Movement Incorporated, the Churches Committee for Voter Registration and Education, Farm Aid, Pioneer Hybrid International Incorporated, the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, the Farm Alliance of Rural Missouri, the Land Stewardship Project, National Catholic Rural Life Conference, National Farmers Union, National Save the Farm Coalition. We are grateful to the Iowa Public Television Network and C-SPAN for this live broadcast. As we close, I would just like to urge again, citizens of Iowa, attend the caucus on February 8th. And those of you all across this great nation who care about land and water and good food and our economy, get involved in the critical issues of this election year and choose wisely the next President of the United States. Thank you for joining us this afternoon.
You've been watching a Democratic presidential candidates debate from Ames, Iowa. This program will re-air on C-SPAN this evening beginning at 1:40 a.m. Eastern Time. That's 10:40 p.m. on the West Coast.